right. So, welcome everybody. I'm John Duggan. I am from the American Counseling Association and am pleased to be presenting this session. I think that there were a few other people who kind of bookmarked this. And I see that there are some folks who are both practitioners as well as educators working with master's and doctoral level students. So I kind of want to offer kind of a general overview of kind of how we'll look at things, and then offer some suggestions, and then if possible have a little bit of dialogue between the members who are part of the live session. And of course, if there's any questions that come, if you're watching this on a recording and you have any questions or things like that, please feel free to reach out to me either through the Whova app, or I can be reached at jduggan@counseling.org. So, excuse me, with that, I'm probably going to be sipping my Diet Coke because it's a little hot and humid, and allergies are going here in Washington, D.C., where I am. And I hope that wherever you are, that you're safe, well, and feeling comfortable. To get us kind of rolling as kind of an overall concept, looking at this through the lens of the 2014 ACA Code of Ethics, which is the pretty much the ethical standard for professional counselors, school counselors, kind of wherever we're practice setting is. And the reason why I frame it this way is even if one is not necessarily a member of the association, it is quite possible that if an ethical issue or a risk management issue or something comes up and it goes to a court or to some other body, one will be held to a particular ethical standard that will be the standard of care by which the court, the judge, or other groups will kind of assess the best practice of the profession. Now, typically, the codes of ethics for all of the professions are about 15 to 20 years ahead of regulatory and legislative issues. It just there's this lag that goes on. It's pretty common. But the other thing that I want to offer for you to consider is that if you're working in an interdisciplinary care setting, so for example, there are a lot of there's a lot of funding, and there are a lot of organizations that are emerging in the telehealth space using technology, and there are loads of job opportunities that are available there. Well, as one who's kind of doing some consulting and working with these different groups that are, having some seed money or some federal government money to help them move it forward, what needs to happen is that they actually need to look at the standards of care for a particular set. So for us, it would be psychology, counseling, marriage and family, social work, and could include nurse practitioners and those that have prescriptive authority, depending on where they're located, so that they can find kind of like the highest level of the standard of care, and then look at how to kind of set a baseline for their policy and procedures. So if you're a private practice owner, or if you have students who aspire to that, what I would suggest is that, first, don't overwhelm, but focus on the ACA Code of Ethics, but remind them that, even as a private practice owner, we have to have our own policy and procedures in place. And usually those are aligned with the HIPAA, area, HIPAA and high tech area of areas of standards, but we need to then bring in our ACA perspective. The other thing that can be different is, like, if you look at the ACA Code of Ethics, and this is related to the concept of advocacy, is we have a standard that says counselors do not fee split. So that means that if a practice, the way it used to work, is that if a practice gets paid $100 for a visit, the owner would keep $60. That's a 60% keep, and or $40, let's say, and then $60 would go to the practitioner, 60%. So that would be a 60-40 split. The reason why that was worked into the code back in 2014 is because there are many state and federal laws that get real tricky around um, whether or not that is actually an inducement for uh, for somebody to be making a referral to you. If they're an independent contractor, now it's even an area of employment law where you really probably should be checking with an employment attorney if you're looking to hire people to figure out if they should actually be employees. Okay, so that's kind of a lens of like we need to be looking at our code of ethics as well as perhaps other codes. Um, the other thing is making sure that either we're developing policies and procedures or that we are attentive to the policies and procedures of the organization for which we're working, that's employing us, or that we're an independent contractor. The quickest way to get fired by a school, by an agency or a hospital, or to run into some hot water is violating the policy and procedures that are set in place. Now, in terms of advocacy, I just want to make a note as I'm giving an overview of this lens of how we'll look at it. If we notice that the policy and procedure is out of sync with current practice, or that it is an area of opportunity, maybe where there is, public health disparities, and we're noticing that it's like, well, wait a minute, now we really need to be focusing on this as an area to have outreach or to be attentive, or, to make sure that we're not discriminating, that we are offering care to a wide variety of people based on their diverse social identities or their characteristics, that it becomes an opportunity for us to do internal advocacy within the organization, and to find ways to move that policy and procedure forward. So I think that it's not just kind of like, we'll look at it and go, well, geez, this isn't a good policy, and I'm going to ignore it. That becomes an opportunity to then educate and bring forward our understanding as professional counselors and practitioners, better practices that can help maybe an organization that is, for whatever reason, is out of sync with kind of the standard of care that we would have, or to which we aspire. Um, I'm when I spoke with John about this session, one of the things he said was, also make sure that whether it's for students and practitioners, that we're looking at it from a pragmatic sense. So I want for you to also consider the contracts for payment for which, I mean, we need to be paid for the work that we do and for which we are training or trained to do. And so look at the payment models that are out there, and in terms of whether it's third-party reimbursement through a state, federal funded source such as Medicaid. The Veterans Administration has opportunities for counselors, as well as TRICARE or commercial health insurance plans, to make sure that we are in compliance with our contracts. And I'll tell you, one of the things that can get practitioners into some really difficult spaces in clinical practice is if we just sign a contract and say, okay, I'm looking at my fee schedule. And then we take that big book that comes with it, Green Cross, Green Shield, every year is going to have that book that comes. And oftentimes what happens is in that contract that we're signing, it will say here, these are the terms of our agreement. and all of the stuff that's in this big book in the fine print section that we tend not to read, that's also part of the contract. And so we need to be attentive to, whatever agreements we're making. And sometimes those agreements bring us into compliance areas, which is like HIPAA, high tech, and then the omnibus rule of 2013. And all of that really is a reminder that we have to look at ourselves as healthcare business owners or people who are healthcare practitioners, and how it is that we can engage in advocacy, what we can and maybe what we can't do, or how we might be able to take a concept and move it forward, where once upon a time it would be considered straight out advocacy. Um, the first thing that comes to mind is pro bono services, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But for somebody who is contracted for payments, um, you could run into hot water if you start offering pro bono services, or reduced fee setting if you don't have the same fee schedule for all of your clients across the board. And a lot of folks can kind of go, well, I'm just going to ignore it. Well, you could do that, but please understand that if you do, um, you could really wind up in a situation where, especially if it's a Medicaid, if you're working with that, that becomes a potential fraud, waste, and abuse. It becomes a potential felony. So you want to consider that if what you'd like to do is be a professional counselor or be engaged in this type of work, we also have to remember the advocacy of teaching ourselves and taking care of our business so that we are solvent and growing and being able to nurture our own revenue stream so that we can then be available to provide the services to the community for which we're trained to do. I would argue that that is an ethical imperative for us to consider, that if we do things that are cutting corners or maybe reducing our own ability to cover our overhead and make a living, we're doing a disservice in terms of advocacy, because it's really disenfranchising ourselves and our profession, and we're then not able to engage in the services to the community at whole. Okay, because what good is if a practice goes out of business, whether it's an individual practitioner or a group, if you go out of business and you're no longer available, that's more people who aren't going to have access to services. So I would argue that being attentive to these issues is in and of itself an advocacy consideration. Um, there are going to be regulatory issues that I want to suggest we consider, and regulatory can be our licensure board, and it can be other issues that maybe come up in the state, or even in the county. There are going to be some counties where they're going to have regulations about how you have access, how it is that you advertise, signage, and things like that. And so we just need to be attentive to it in order to engage as a business owner. I mentioned the compliance piece. A lot of us at times, and I want to kind of frame this by saying I spend a lot of my time working with either myself or other practitioners at the American Counseling Association, and we're constantly doing consultation on practice and ethical issues for members. And we usually engage in it through a legal ethical decision-making model. That's the one through Nancy Wheeler and Bert Bertram in The Counselor and the Law, because I think it offers a pragmatic way of accessing, the reality of our work. But these questions come in all the time, and one of them is, well, do I need to pay attention to the Americans with Disabilities Act? I'm offering services in my home, or there's a separate office space in my home, or I've converted my garage and my basement, or well, yes, the bottom line is yes, we need to be attentive to these issues and to integrate them into our overall policy and procedure and best way of engaging as a healthcare provider. And I'm going to go back for a second to advocacy from the lens of that insurance contract, making sure that we're actually either having an attorney go over them with us or reading them ourselves and understanding. Um, Personal sharing. Once upon a time, I had what's called an evergreen contract. And so this means that unless I opt out, it renews. It's congratulations, we're contracted again. Well, they worked a new section into this contract that said I was responsible for having a 24/7 HIPAA compliant answering service, um, which had the option to directly connect a client, but any consumer from their group. So even if they hadn't established as a client, but they called it in crisis, and I'm not a crisis, center, they still wanted the option of that caller to go through a decision tree through this answering service and to have someone do a warm handoff to a crisis line that I would identify for my practice. And so what that equated to was $150 per month extra fee added on for, a year or so. And the tricky part is we can't always back out of these contracts overnight. It usually is going to take sometimes up to 6 months. It can take a long time for us to establish them, and it's going to take a long time for us to kind of move them back. The other area that I want to say is pay attention to legal considerations, and that does not mean just mandated reporting and the ethical issues around compliance and stuff like that. We need to be also attentive to things like opinions that are drafted by an attorney general for your jurisdiction, your state, and then consider, has that remained the interpretation of law? Because if the attorney general, and that, Kathy, I can see you're kind of smiling. I think that you're probably remembering the decision that has been made regarding mandated reporting in Maryland. And an attorney general interpreted that and basically said that if a client gives us enough information that is reportable, that we are required to report it at any age and stage of a person's life here in Maryland, where the person is living, but also if like the perpetrator is 6 hours away or was last known to be living in this area or address, we are also then required to make a report in this other jurisdiction as well. And so that was the interpretation, and it has never been revised. So what that means is it stands as the legal way that we have to navigate the regulation or the law. Now, the law doesn't go into that nitty-gritty information, yet the Attorney General's position says that. And one of the exercises for those that are counselor educators that I like to do with students is, often nowadays we're doing them in Zoom classes and breakout rooms. But what I'll do is I'll set it up so that everyone has I'll select a government website that is usually keeping information current. And so what I'm trying to do is give them a heads up of, wink, wink, you ought to keep this in your bookmarks or in your practice. Once upon a time, we would call it a Rolodex, but your iPhone or what have you. I'm dating myself. But making sure that you have that available. But then what we'll do is we'll break out into small groups of like 7 or 8, and there'll be 2 or 3 people per group. And I'll ask specific questions in terms of select a state or jurisdiction. It could be the US Virgin Islands or Washington, D.C. Select a jurisdiction where you're practicing. Look at your discipline and your scope of practice. Consider the advocacy issues that we need across the lifespan, and then start looking from the federal definition of a concept, such as maybe it's adult protective services or something like that. Um, and then what are the requirements at the state level? What are the requirements at uh, the federal level? And making sure that we are kind of hitting all the benchmarks, but being aware of the different trainings that we may be required to have. And then also being aware and helping them. It's again, it's like a wink, wink, like this is also an area where you probably want to keep this handy, because as you're engaging in your practicum or moving into new professional status, you want to make sure that we're having these available and we're checking them somewhat frequently. I would say probably at least every 6 months to a year at minimum, to make sure that we're aware of this. And so the things that I start looking at from the educational side are, I mean, it ranges from mandated reporting, whether it's child or adult. It could be persons with often grouped as intellectual and developmental differing ability statuses. Could be somebody with a medical condition that is considered in a vulnerable state and therefore requires additional services. And so human trafficking, and all of these different areas, immigration status, and really getting the students and the practitioners to do a deep dive in this and be aware of it. My big takeaway is remember that we are healthcare business practitioners and owners. And so we need to continually move from the place of like we come through maybe a school of education to really seeing ourselves as bona fide healthcare practitioners who are licensed, and we're in a highly regulated field. Now, that being said, I think that there are a lot of amazing opportunities for us to engage in creative advocacy that collaborate with our clients. And I'm going to throw out a few ideas. And, if there's any questions or it's like, hey, shut up on this, let's talk about something else, because I'm really more interested in how we navigate advocacy. Put that in the chat box or grab my attention and let's do it. But the first one that I think is very important is remember that when we develop counseling plans, ethically, we are required to collaborate with the client. And that client may be identified as the individual or a student, if it's in a school setting or a university setting. Um, it may be a group or a family. But as we're doing that, and I'm thinking specifically with individuals, there can be some folks at any age or stage where they're working with us and they're like, okay, I recognize. And the times that this would be most helpful was when I would work somebody who maybe was experiencing periods of a dementia or cognitive impairment, or there may be some neurological issues that are going on. Could be also like a bipolar spectrum or multiple sclerosis, clients who have that if they had a flare up. And what I would do is have them put together a behavioral health advanced directive, or it's sometimes called the psychiatric advanced directive is one way to search that. The Bazelon Center for Law focuses on behavioral health issues, and they have they used to have some sample templates. But what's of value is that it can go down, and we work with the client to develop this kind of care plan, and it is brought back to the client and perhaps shared with other practitioners if somebody gets into a state where they are needing a greater level of care, and that could include hospitalization or medications. And what they do is they go through and they say, these are the things that I want. These are the things that I would prefer not to have in an ideal situation. These are the medications that, absolutely out. This is bad news for me. I have an adverse or a paradoxical response to it, and these are the things that are helpful. So please consider this. And this goes off to a prescriber if I'm in a situation where I need help. Um, where it becomes helpful is that if somebody starts to have, for example, manic thought processes or, kind of impaired cognition, uh, but they're kind of on the cusp. We can present this and say, we both agree to this is in your handwriting. Do you recognize the handwriting? This is your handwriting. We've both signed this, and it includes a release to other practitioners. Do you understand what's going on? The the key point is that it allows a client who is able to see that this is their own decision making process, to say, oh gosh, yes, I've been here before, or ooh, I've never been down this path before, but it looks like I may need to get some inpatient help, and this is going to really be helpful. And so what we can do then, again, including their permission and authorization, we can share that with other practitioners, with family members, with whomever they feel. But they're also going to include, probably in that advanced directive, folks that are going to be most helpful, to come and see them and to provide support and care, as well as those that maybe for the time being they don't want to see. And that can include healthcare practitioners too. So that's just one area of advocacy where I think it's underutilized by us, and uh, could be considered as a tool or a resource to help somebody at really any age or stage, so long as they're kind of the age of behavioral health to make those healthcare decisions on their own. Um, the other piece has to do with practitioners. Code of ethics says that we should, have a plan in place for disability, for death, for a variety of issues where we become impaired. Okay, so I think having that in place is critical, and making sure that, it's like all those loose ends that we would consider. I remember that once upon a time I was lying on my back, and I would say, when you're getting ready for back surgery, you do not want to have to be moving an office. Pro tip. Uh, and thankfully, I had set my practice up so I had secure encrypted electronic health records. And so the whole piece of custody, of actually having somebody else take over the records, thank goodness I was able to kind of put the records that were printed in a bag, and I hobbled along as my spouse, my husband, you know, helped carry the bag to the car, but it stayed in my custody. But if we have paper records and you're looking to make some sort of move, and it is in an adverse experience, you really kind of want to plan ahead and think of those issues. And that includes having a healthcare will. Do we have somebody who is actually credentialed at our status as professional counselors, who is authorized to step in, has the access, the information, and the know-how, and you've set up a business associate agreement to kind of cover that, and you keep renewing it to make sure that if something happens, you have a plan in place so that maybe somebody can step in and reach out to our clients in the event that we are disabled, we're hospitalized, that, they can pick up with the care, or work with the clients to get them to other service providers so that care continues on, um, and so on. The other issue I would say is consultation. We've got to be involved in consultation, but this is advocacy for the profession. Realize that consultation is not something that carries the same level of confidentiality when we're working with clients. There's actually no provision for that. So when you're consulting, it's really critical that you're making sure that you're disguising client information, that you are doing it in typically a confidential manner. So that means sound machines. That means that even if we're doing it virtually because of a pandemic, you still want to have all of those provisions in place to say, I am in a confidential setting. Usually I would be wearing a headphone with a microphone or earbuds or something so that nobody else could hear what's going on. And also making sure that the things that I'm talking about are being shared through a medium that is going to be HIPAA compliant, so that have that encryption and all these other things. Why is this showing up why am I bringing this up in a session on ethics and advocacy? Well, A1A of the ACA Code of Ethics, we need to pay attention to the client dignity and welfare. And so in order to do that, and in order to maintain all of the other things that we have in our code about confidentiality, about client or patient rights, depending on your practice setting, student rights, we have to be attentive to all of these issues and to make sure that we're getting outside information to help us make good decisions with the student or client. So consultation is a really big one. I would say the other one is wellness. I think that most of us have done or seen a lot of trainings and read a lot of books. And if you go to Counseling Today or some other articles that are out there, it's in terms of we really need to make sure that we are well rested. Uh, you know, even if there's a sleep disorder, sleep apnea, or working too much, those are things that can diminish our capacity to be attentive to our clients and students. And so that diminishes our capacity in that day or that treatment setting. Even if you have allergies and you're feeling unwell, there may be times where it's important to stand back and make that decision and say, I can't see everybody that was scheduled. I need to take a sick day in order to kind of do some recoup and make sure that we're, taking care of ourselves. Um, let's see, for other areas of advocacy, I think that we need to look at some specialized training. So if you look at my LinkedIn profile, I keep adding in these new trainings that I'm doing. So like one was looking at, and they're fairly inexpensive. I'm talking, $25 for um, a 6 hour or really a 3 or 4 week course. And it could be from Johns Hopkins University. It could come through the University of Texas, University of Melbourne, and Australia, but looking at things like population health issues and how is it that we are attentive to the emerging disparities that are going on. But then as we're educating ourselves in maybe topics that we might consider as related to medicine or nursing or another area, it doesn't mean that we're stepping outside of our scope of practice, but I think what it does is it gives us the ability to then show up at the table. And when I say at the table, that means the town, the county, the state, where we can be a voice of advocacy to make sure that issues related to those specializations that we have as professional counselors are integrated into the policy making at the local level. And having that training and being able to speak the language of another healthcare practitioner, because those jobs, those leaders who are heading up the county initiative may have a public health degree, and they may be a physician or a nurse practitioner. Being able to then translate it and understand their language, but then show up with our needs of our communities that we're representing, I think is a very strong piece of advocacy. One example of how I engaged in that over the years was here in Montgomery County, Maryland, we looked at the issue of hoarding and how it is that sometimes it became a public health risk, uh, and how it is that fire, police, safety, animal uh, patrol, or the animal officers, as well as those of us that worked in behavioral health, working with people of age, of any age, it could be seniors, persons with disabilities, how it was though that we could then work together, be attentive to compliance and regulatory issues, who can say what to whom. And, you know, it was a very complex process. And we worked with the county attorney. But showing up at that table and having that voice, I believe, is a critical piece of advocacy, and it moves us into public health policy. Um, Usually, these are things that are not part of our graduate training. They usually show up at the doctoral level, if they show up at all. I think that a lot of times they come in through your associations and through professional training and networking. But what I want to do is say that this is an ethical imperative. I go back to some of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, who was coming out of the, the philosophical school, the French school, post World War II. So we're thinking around the time that counseling emerged as a profession. We're looking at the United Nations, the World Health Organization. There's a lot of this kind of thought that is looking at how it is that we need to protect the welfare of others. Okay. And Levinas's perspective was we are human beings in worlds of meaning, and we have an ethical responsibility to the other. How it is that we engage, help, support, that every time we meet another human being, it is an opportunity to be attentive. And I think that that is a critical way to understand how it is that we engage in advocacy. We may not be able to, let me rephrase this, we may discover in a counseling session or relationship an advocacy issue that we cannot personally address at that time. However, it informs us, I think, to then ethically work in ways where we can bring that need or concern, whether it's to educational sessions, to legislators, to politicians who are representing the needs, to those that are spending public money or making policies, to then become aware of it. So we're not necessarily advocating specifically on the behalf of this client, but yet finding a way that we can still engage in that type of work. However, the way that we are practicing, and that's what the Code of Ethics is about. It's about ethical practice and how it is that we can have better practice opportunities. That becomes also a way to work with our clients and advocate on their behalf. For example, how we, I mean, it's the bane of so many practitioners, but it's like how we document. And I've had so many folks who say, I can't wait to get out of the hospital gig or out of the agency and own my own business so that I don't have to do all the documentation stuff. And all I can tell you is no. You're going to have more work, and you're going to be responsible for all of the stuff that I've been talking about. And people are usually kind of like, I really don't want to hear this or pay attention to this. You know, I just want to be a counselor, but we're a regulated healthcare profession now. And so what this means is that the way that we document can actually be in the better interest of our client. Because if they are at some point in need of accommodation through the Americans with Disabilities Act, if they need COBRA, or if they need, the FMLA, there are times where if we are documenting well and properly, not overly documenting, not revealing things that would be inappropriate. But if we're understanding how to do it, that becomes a tool for advocacy. And I will tell you that I have seen situations, I've worked on cases where um, different disciplines have done reviews through Social Security and disability, and have made determinations, and it can come from a medical professional, and having good solid documentation and presenting it to the client, who then presents it to the administrator. Notice that I'm not releasing the information for them, but what I'm saying is I've documented it and gone through and really done the assessments and put together a synopsis. Uh, and it takes time to do that. That may be our advocacy. That may be our pro bono, is to say, okay, I'm going to spend an hour writing this report, and I know that I'm not going to get charged for it. I would when I had my own practice, I would have a separate CPT code that I would make up. It might be like 0000-A or B or whatever, but that would be my code for pro bono services and time that I would give back to a client or to my folks in general to be able to advocate on their behalf and write these reports. And I have seen times where people in need of certain services or accommodations or disability were actually reconsidered, and a decision could be overturned, even if it is by somebody who's considered a higher authority or degreed person. Because they're coming from, the medical model, and so we're going to trust the board of the physician over a master's or a doctoral level practitioner. So that is the source of advocacy, and I think that even though it takes a bit of time and patience on our part to pay attention to for our clients. And maybe one other area that I would offer before we open it up. I know our time is coming short, but looking at issues regarding parity. We've had this parity bill for access to care for years, and it has been included in the Affordable Care Act, Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And what happens is a lot of times there truly isn't parity in terms of people who are needing services. And so I think that brings us back to really fine tuning how it is that we do our assessment, and we're looking at the whole person. And I like to look at so many different areas and to collaborate if needed with with different disciplines. And so if I'm working with someone who, let's say, is of age where all of a sudden they're starting to have difficulties with sleep, they have no family members or support system left. They're perhaps they're 80, 85 years old, and they're struggling, but they are able to maintain living in place. That becomes an opportunity to then have within my new school Rolodex physicians who are specialists in gerontology care or neurology, so that we can rule out some issues that could have been never really recognized, but that may be manifesting. And so that becomes the insomnia, the anxiety, and the inability to sleep. And rather than somebody, getting all these medications thrown at them by their physician, doing it in a way that is going to be pragmatic and helpful. But then the other side for advocacy is parity of care, making sure that we are really doing things to make sure that we are getting paid at a rate that is respectable or congruent with other professions. Now, one of the challenges is physicians have always had a higher rate, not because they have a medical degree, but oftentimes it's argued that because they have a staff of nurses, medical assistants, physician assistants, so they're covering multiple professions that are working with them at the same time. Well, sometimes we have staffs too. A lot of times they may be, a virtual assistant or somebody who is contracted to do multiple practices. But I think that we need to bring that into the equation to make sure that we're advocating and we're demonstrating that we're providing excellent care. And we, as counselors, uh, are deserving of equitable reimbursement and pay that other practitioners of different professions that are similar to ours would also experience. I noticed something in the chat, Kathy. Did you want to share anything or thoughts if you want to unmic?
It was an interesting news item not too long ago that there, I don't know if it was consideration or if it was really approved, but the documented long-term, long-haul COVID symptoms are added as a verifiable, justifiable disability. And then as far as advocacy, there were other long-term health conditions, autoimmune things, PCOS, different things. Aha, these are their long-term chronic conditions. Can we then add those into another recognizable
Category.
disability to
Yeah.
then increase access to giving the appropriate support services to appropriate folks, that you're not just gaming the system, that this is a true and real thing, and can we give you the supports that you need to maintain independence and a good quality of life?
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. And I think that, so for anyone who may be an educator who is looking at this, as well as practitioners too, that we're attentive to, like when we're looking at the courses on or the areas of practice on professional development for assessment and working, disorders that maybe mimic a behavioral health concern. When I teach like the diagnostic or psychopathology class, I'll bring in some of the research that's emerging that you're talking about, Kathy, and also say, well, we need to find a way to categorize this and name this at this point, because it's not showing up in any of the the ICD manuals. It's not going to be in the DSM. However, what would we do for somebody who has a similar neurological condition, for, let's say, multiple sclerosis or encephalitis, or some other type of brain or heart swelling or lung issues, where we know that these are the areas that potentially can really adversely, clinically remarkable impairment for an individual, and then find ways to be of support. And so I think that your piece of, we're not gaming the system, it's like, let's make sure that this gets named. However, the person may be showing up in our practice because they're feeling peripheral neuropathy in the way that somebody who has a spine condition or a diabetic condition can feel similar things. And what does that do to the individual's quality of life and ability to function? It's like all of a sudden you realize, I'm not able to use the can opener the way that I used to, or
Exactly.
these have emotional consequences and relational. So great point. Great point. Any other thoughts? Or I feel like I've sucked the air out of the room. My hope is that I've actually contributed some perspective, but any other thoughts of things that um, you think in terms of advocacy? Um, I did mention pro bono counseling. I'm just in the last couple of minutes, I'll follow up maybe on that. Um, Remember that a lot of counselors would like to, I would like to say that I could look at the overall needs for a particular client and then make decisions and offer a pay scale that is going to be equitable to them. And also, especially if they find hard times. Um, the tricky part is when someone is contracted with a health insurance third party reimbursement. And usually that means in this day and age that we are a HIPAA covered entity. It's almost impossible to, if HIPAA were a person, they would be probably 25 years old. They would be out in the world. They'd uh, be probably eligible for their parents' health insurance for one more year and under the Affordable Care Act, and then they're on their own. So my point is it's really become a benchmark. So whether or not one technically is a covered entity or not, I think is an age-old argument. I think that a better practice is to say, I'm going to act as if I am. And if you are, but technically, if you're covered, that means you cannot discriminate under HIPAA. And discrimination can be even deemed as having a different pay scale for a different person. And so how do you manage that in your own business? In Maryland, one of the areas that might come into play is contracting with a nonprofit or volunteering time. There's the uh, uh, pro bono, um, I forget the full name of it, but it's a healthcare service in Maryland where it's a nonprofit and you
Give an
donate
hour.
time. The Pro Bono Project. And,
Yep.
and what they do is they become the entity for which one donates time. But you also have to be prepared that, the client may come back and say, thank you so much for this. We've gotten through the worst of it and we cannot wait for our upcoming vacation. And you're sitting there going, what? I haven't had a vacation in 3 years. I'm not, you're going to Jamaica and, huh? So you need to also kind of, consider those issues as well. But find ways to give back to the community, um, and it doesn't necessarily. It may not be permissible for us to do it in terms of monetary, um, changing of fees, waiving of co-payments. Going to get you in hot water. um, you know, not doing regular audits. I think that's an area of advocacy. It's a terribly boring one, but it is one where if you're not actually, you or somebody on your team is not acting as a compliance officer and an audit officer, and what that means is you're checking the reimbursements, you're checking the amounts that you're charging in terms of collecting deductibles, that it may be the same healthcare brand or company, but there could be 5 different policies that, or, HMO, PPO, all of these different categories. Each one of them for each client is going to be different. So you can't assume that they're all the same and just say, I'm going to do everything the same. So the tricky part is making sure that we're staying on top of that, and then also auditing our records to make sure that they're meeting, you know, scope of practice and standards, and having an audit team maybe that is from outside of your practice to be able to go through and say, thanks for sharing these. They're redacted. I'm not seeing the information, the confidential stuff. Here are areas where I would make improvements. Because if we're not doing that, we're really then setting ourselves up to be of a disservice to our clients, and to our community. So um, I think that this is probably a unique perspective on advocacy, and through the ethical lens, but my goal is to offer it in a way that is going to help us as practitioners, but also to be attentive to the needs of our clients and also our ecological system, our communities, both locally and larger across the country, and finding ways to really focus on the dignity and welfare of everyone, uh, including ourselves, including each other, practitioners. So Any last thoughts as we wrap up? Hope it's been helpful. It's good to see you, and I hope that anyone who's is watching this on demand it also finds it beneficial. So, thank you for coming, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.